The pedestrian signal at the intersection of Peachtree Street and 14th in Atlanta changed to the walking figure at 3:42 p.m. on a Thursday in late September, and Eleanor Hayes stepped off the curb with the careful deliberation of a 73-year-old woman who had learned not to trust that drivers would respect her right-of-way. She had her cane in her right hand, her purse over her left shoulder, and she was crossing from the northeast corner toward the southwest, heading to the MARTA station after a morning spent volunteering at the public library, where she had worked for 2 decades before her judicial appointment. Eleanor had been a judge on the Fulton County Superior Court for 18 years before retiring 5 years ago, and before that she had been a civil rights attorney and a public defender and a community organizer. She had spent 50 years working within and around the legal system, had sentenced defendants and reviewed evidence and written opinions that shaped how justice was administered in Atlanta. But at this moment, she was simply an elderly black woman crossing a street, and that was the only identity that mattered to Officer Derek Matthews. Officer Matthews was 28 years old, white, and had been with the Atlanta Police Department for 4 years. He was driving his patrol car west on 14th Street, approaching the intersection where Eleanor was crossing, and he was in a hurry because he had just received a call about a disturbance at a retail store 6 blocks away. The light was yellow when he reached the intersection, and rather than stopping, he accelerated to make it through before it turned red. Eleanor was in the middle of the crosswalk when she saw the patrol car accelerating toward her, and she stopped walking, uncertain whether the officer would stop or whether she needed to move back to avoid being hit. The patrol car did stop, but only after entering the crosswalk, and it stopped abruptly enough that Eleanor stumbled slightly, catching herself with her cane. Officer Matthews rolled down his window and leaned out, his face tight with irritation. "Move it along, you're holding up traffic." Eleanor looked at him with the expression she had perfected over decades on the bench, the look that communicated both authority and restrained disappointment. "I have the right of way. The signal indicates I should be crossing. I don't care what the signal says. I've got an emergency call, move." Eleanor continued crossing at her own pace, refusing to be rushed, and Officer Matthews, apparently deciding that verbal commands were insufficient, put his car in park and got out. He walked quickly to where Eleanor was still crossing, now about 3/4 of the way across the intersection, and without warning or justification, he placed his hand on her shoulder and pushed her, not hard enough to knock her down, but firmly enough that she stumbled and had to catch herself again with her cane. "I told you to move," Officer Matthews said, his voice raised, his posture aggressive. Eleanor stopped and turned to face him fully, and her voice when she spoke was controlled but hard. "You just committed assault on a civilian who was lawfully using a crosswalk. You need to remove your hand from my person immediately. Don't tell me what I need to do. You need to follow police instructions. Now move before I arrest you for obstruction." Eleanor reached into her purse, moving slowly and deliberately, so the officer would not misinterpret the action, and she pulled out a wallet. From the wallet, she extracted her retired judge identification card, the one that still carried weight in Fulton County courthouses, and she held it up for Officer Matthews to see. "I am Eleanor Hayes, retired judge of the Fulton County Superior Court. You have just committed assault and battery on my person in front of multiple witnesses and likely multiple recording devices. You are going to step away from me now. You are going to provide me with your name and badge number. And then you are going to wait while I contact your supervising officer to report this incident." Officer Matthews stared at the identification card, and something in his face changed, the irritation replaced by something that might have been recognition or fear, or the sudden awareness that he had made a serious error in judgment. He stepped back, his hands moving away from Eleanor, and he looked around the intersection as if noticing for the first time that there were indeed multiple people watching, several of whom had their phones out and appeared to be recording. "I didn't know," he said, and the words came out defensive rather than apologetic. "You should have identified yourself." "I should not have needed to identify myself. I was lawfully crossing a street. You chose to assault me rather than simply waiting the 30 seconds it would have taken me to complete my crossing. The fact that I am a retired judge is irrelevant to whether your actions constituted misconduct, but it will be relevant to how this incident is processed and investigated." Officer Matthews provided his name and badge number, his voice subdued now, and Eleanor wrote the information down in the small notebook she always carried. She also noted the patrol car number, the time, the location, and the names of two witnesses who approached to offer statements. One of them, a young black man in his 20s, told Eleanor he had recorded the entire interaction on his phone and would be happy to provide the video as evidence. Eleanor thanked him, collected his contact information, and then called the Atlanta Police Department's Internal Affairs Division directly, using a number she knew from memory because she had dealt with police misconduct cases throughout her career. She reported the incident with precise detail, identifying herself and providing Officer Matthews' information, and she was told that a supervisor would be dispatched to the scene immediately. If you are reading this account and recognizing something familiar in the dynamics of how a police officer treated an elderly black woman with contempt and aggression until discovering her institutional authority, consider how many similar interactions occur where the victim does not have judicial credentials or powerful connections, where abuse of police power goes unreported or unaddressed because those targeted lack the resources or knowledge to challenge it. The act of sharing these stories ensures that the patterns they reveal cannot be ignored. The supervisor who arrived was a lieutenant named Patricia Alvarez, a Latina woman in her early 40s who had a reputation for taking officer misconduct seriously. She spoke with Eleanor first, taking a detailed statement, reviewing the video that the young man had recorded, and examining the intersection to understand the physical layout and sight lines. Then she spoke with Officer Matthews privately, and though Eleanor could not hear the conversation, she could see that it was tense, that the lieutenant's body language conveyed displeasure, and that Officer Matthews' defensive posture was gradually collapsing into something that looked like resignation. Lieutenant Alvarez returned to Eleanor and apologized formally on behalf of the Atlanta Police Department, acknowledging that the officer's conduct had been inappropriate and that a full investigation would be conducted through internal affairs. She offered to arrange medical attention if Eleanor had been injured, offered to provide transportation if Eleanor needed it, and provided her direct contact information for any follow-up Eleanor might need. Eleanor declined medical attention because she was not injured beyond some soreness that would likely manifest later, and she declined transportation because she was capable of walking the remaining 2 blocks to the MARTA station. But she made clear that she would be following this incident through to whatever resolution internal affairs determined, that she would be monitoring the investigation personally, and that she expected accountability. "This is not the first time I have witnessed or experienced police misconduct," Eleanor told Lieutenant Alvarez, "and I know from long experience that officers are rarely held accountable for how they treat civilians, particularly black civilians, particularly elderly black women who are perceived as powerless. Officer Matthews made assumptions about who I was based on how I look, and he felt entitled to put his hands on me because he assumed I would not or could not challenge his authority. That assumption was incorrect in my case, but I am thinking about all the people he has interacted with who did not have my background or my knowledge of the system or my ability to demand accountability. How many of them has he treated with similar disrespect or violence?" Lieutenant Alvarez did not have an answer to that question, or if she did, she was not willing to share it with Eleanor in this context. But she assured Eleanor that Officer Matthews' history would be reviewed as part of the investigation, that any pattern of misconduct would be taken into account, and that the department took these incidents seriously. Eleanor was skeptical, had seen too many investigations that resulted in minor discipline or no discipline at all, had watched the machinery of institutional protection shield officers from consequences, while civilians were told that policies had been followed and that their complaints were unfounded. But she also knew that her position as a retired judge gave her leverage that most complainants did not have, that her complaint would be harder to dismiss or minimize, and that she had both the knowledge and the resources to escalate if the department failed to act appropriately. She went home to her house in the Cascade neighborhood, a comfortable 3-bedroom home she had owned for 30 years, and she sat in her living room thinking about what had happened at the intersection. The physical impact of being pushed was minor, would leave no lasting injury beyond some bruising. But the psychological impact was more significant, the reminder that even after 50 years of professional achievement and community respect, she could still be treated as disposable by a police officer who saw only her race and her age and made assumptions about her powerlessness. Eleanor had experienced racism throughout her life, had faced discrimination in law school and in early legal practice, and even on the bench where she had been one of the few black women judges in Fulton County. She had learned to navigate these experiences with dignity and strategy, had developed thick skin and sharp instincts for when to push back and when to document and when to choose battles carefully. But there was something particularly galling about being physically pushed in a crosswalk by an officer who was supposed to be protecting public safety, about being told to move faster by someone who had violated traffic laws to rush through an intersection. She called her daughter Lisa, who lived in Decatur with her husband and 2 teenage children. Lisa was a social worker, had inherited her mother's commitment to justice and her careful attention to institutional dynamics. When Eleanor described what had happened, Lisa's response was immediate and fierce. "Did he hurt you? Are you okay?" "I'm fine physically, some soreness, but nothing serious. I'm more concerned about ensuring there are consequences for his behavior. You need to file a formal complaint, and you should talk to a lawyer about whether to pursue civil action. I've already filed a complaint with Internal Affairs. I'll wait to see how that proceeds before deciding whether additional action is necessary. But Lisa, I want you to understand something. This happened to me, and I have resources and knowledge and connections that will help ensure accountability. But this kind of thing happens constantly to people who don't have those advantages. Officer Matthews treated me with contempt because he saw an elderly black woman and assumed I was powerless. How many other people has he treated similarly? How many of them were able to challenge him?" Lisa was quiet for a moment. "What are you going to do?" "I'm going to make sure this incident is investigated thoroughly, and I'm going to think about what else can be done to address the broader pattern, because individual accountability for one officer is necessary, but not sufficient." Over the following days, Eleanor received updates from Internal Affairs about the investigation. Officer Matthews had been placed on administrative leave pending the outcome. Multiple witnesses had been interviewed, and their statements were consistent with Eleanor's account. The video recorded by the young man at the intersection clearly showed the officer pushing Eleanor without justification. And a review of Officer Matthews' disciplinary record revealed that this was not his first complaint, that he had received 2 previous complaints for excessive force and 1 for discourteous treatment, though none of those complaints had resulted in significant discipline. The pattern was familiar to Eleanor from her years on the bench, the accumulation of incidents that individually might be dismissed as misunderstandings or judgment calls, but that collectively revealed a problem with how an officer approached the job and interacted with civilians. The challenge was that police departments were often reluctant to act on patterns, treated each incident as isolated, gave officers chance after chance, while the civilians they harmed had no recourse beyond filing complaints that rarely led to meaningful change. Eleanor requested a meeting with the chief of police, a black man named Ronald Davis, who had been appointed 2 years earlier with a mandate to reform the department and rebuild community trust. Chief Davis agreed to meet, and they sat in his office at police headquarters, a space decorated with commendations and photos from his 30-year career in law enforcement. "Judge Hayes, I want to apologize personally for what Officer Matthews did," Chief Davis began. "His conduct was completely inappropriate, and I can assure you that we take this incident very seriously." "I appreciate the apology, Chief Davis, but what I'm more interested in is understanding what systemic changes are being implemented to prevent similar incidents. Officer Matthews had previous complaints. Why was he still on patrol without additional training or supervision?" Chief Davis shifted in his chair, clearly uncomfortable. "The previous complaints were investigated and determined to be within policy guidelines, or they were resolved informally. The disciplinary system has constraints, including union protections and civil service rules, that limit our ability to take stronger action without clear evidence of policy violations. So, officers can accumulate complaints, can demonstrate patterns of misconduct, and as long as each individual incident doesn't quite cross the threshold for formal discipline, they continue working with no consequences. That's the system you're describing. That's the system I inherited, and I'm working to change it. But change in a police department is slow and requires navigating political realities and union agreements and civil service protections." Eleanor leaned forward slightly. "I understand the constraints. I've worked within institutional systems my entire career. But I also understand that constraints can be used as excuses for inaction, that institutional inertia often serves to protect officers at the expense of civilian safety. Officer Matthews put his hands on me because he felt entitled to do so, because he has learned through experience that he can treat people disrespectfully without consequences. That's a cultural problem, not just an individual problem. What would you like to see happen? I'd like to see Officer Matthews terminated. I'd like to see a comprehensive review of all officers with multiple complaints, with mandatory retraining or reassignment for those showing patterns of misconduct. I'd like to see community oversight with real authority, not just advisory capacity, and I'd like to see the department acknowledge publicly that what happened to me reflects a broader problem with how officers are trained to interact with civilians, particularly black civilians. Chief Davis nodded slowly. I can commit to a comprehensive review of officers with multiple complaints. I can commit to pushing for stronger community oversight, though that requires City Council approval. What I cannot commit to is terminating Officer Matthews without going through the full process, because if I did that, the union would challenge it, and he'd likely be reinstated with back pay. The system requires due process, even for officers who deserve to be fired. It was an honest answer, and Eleanor appreciated the honesty, even as she was frustrated by the constraints it described. The system was designed to protect officers, to give them chance after chance, to require overwhelming evidence before taking action that might end their careers. The same system did not extend similar protections to civilians who were harmed by officer misconduct, did not give them multiple chances or benefit of the doubt, or procedural safeguards against mistreatment. I'll be monitoring this case closely, Eleanor said, and I'll be speaking publicly about it, because I think it's important that people understand how police accountability actually works, or doesn't work. She did speak publicly, giving an interview to the Atlanta Journal-Constitution about the incident and about the broader challenges of police accountability. The article ran with the headline, "Retired Judge Assaulted by Atlanta Officer Speaks Out About Police Reform," and it included Eleanor's account of being pushed in the crosswalk, Chief Davis's response, and context about police misconduct investigations and discipline in Atlanta. The article generated significant attention, was shared widely on social media, prompted discussions on local news programs and in community meetings. Some people praised Eleanor for using her platform to highlight police misconduct, for refusing to stay silent, even though she had the option of handling the matter quietly through official channels. Others criticized her for going public, accused her of undermining police morale or of making it harder for officers to do their jobs, or of being divisive. The criticism came disproportionately from police unions and from conservative commentators, who treated any critique of police conduct as attack on law enforcement generally. Eleanor had anticipated this response, had seen it countless times during her career, when anyone questioned police practices or demanded accountability. The pattern was predictable. Frame criticism as anti-police, suggest that officers were the real victims, minimize or excuse misconduct as the result of split-second decisions or stressful working conditions, and attack the credibility of those raising concerns. Eleanor responded in a follow-up op-ed, writing about her respect for law enforcement and her recognition that policing was difficult and dangerous work, while also being clear that respect for police did not mean accepting misconduct, that supporting officers meant holding them to high standards, and that true reform required honest examination of systemic problems rather than defensive deflection. The op-ed resonated with many readers, particularly in black communities where experiences with aggressive or disrespectful policing were common, where people had their own stories of being treated as suspicious or dangerous simply for existing in public space, where encounters with officers were often characterized by assumption of criminality rather than presumption of innocence. Eleanor received dozens of emails and letters from people sharing their own experiences, describing incidents where officers had been rude or aggressive or violent, where complaints had been filed and then dismissed, where civilians had been left feeling powerless and unseen. The messages reinforced what Eleanor already knew from her judicial career, which was that the incident at the crosswalk was not exceptional but representative, that Officer Matthews's treatment of her reflected patterns that were widespread and systemic. She also received messages from police officers, some hostile but some thoughtful and concerned, acknowledging that misconduct existed and that accountability was inadequate, expressing frustration with union protections that shielded problem officers and with leadership that was more concerned about public relations than about actual reform. These messages complicated the narrative that discussions about police misconduct were simply civilians versus officers, revealed that many officers recognized the problems and wanted to be part of solutions, but felt constrained by institutional culture and union politics. The Internal Affairs investigation concluded 3 months after the incident, determining that Officer Matthews had violated department policies regarding use of force and professional conduct. The recommended discipline was a 30-day suspension without pay and mandatory retraining. The recommendation went to the Chief of Police for approval and then would be subject to review by a disciplinary board that included union representation. Eleanor thought the discipline was insufficient given the circumstances and given Officer Matthews's history of complaints, thought that an officer who put hands on a civilian without justification should face more significant consequences than a brief suspension. But she also understood the constraints that Chief Davis had described, understood that even this level of discipline would likely face union challenge, and that terminating the officer would require navigating complex procedural requirements and potential litigation. She attended the disciplinary hearing, which was open to the public, and she gave a statement about the incident and about why she believed more serious discipline was warranted. Officer Matthews also gave a statement, apologizing for his actions and describing the stress he had been under that day, the emergency call he had been responding to, the split-second decision he had made that he now recognized was wrong. The apology felt performative to Eleanor, felt like the kind of statement attorneys coached clients to make when facing consequences, hitting all the expected notes of contrition without conveying genuine understanding of what had been wrong about the behavior. But the disciplinary board accepted the apology as evidence of remorse, confirmed the 30-day suspension, and added a requirement that Officer Matthews complete diversity and de-escalation training before returning to patrol duties. It was a modest accountability, the kind that felt like a compromise between doing nothing and doing enough, and Eleanor left the hearing feeling dissatisfied, but not surprised. This was how the system worked, protecting officers through process and procedure and the benefit of doubt, requiring civilians to accept minimal consequences as sufficient redress for mistreatment. But Eleanor was not finished. If the formal disciplinary system was constrained by institutional protections and procedural requirements, there were other avenues for seeking change and accountability. She began working with community organizations that focused on police reform, lending her expertise and credibility to campaigns for stronger civilian oversight, for changes to the police union contract that would make discipline more feasible, for state legislation that would address qualified immunity and other legal doctrines that shielded officers from civil liability. The work was slow and often frustrating, involved countless meetings and strategy sessions and public hearings, where the same arguments were made repeatedly by the same sides. Police unions and their allies argued that reform proposals would make policing impossible, would prevent officers from making quick decisions, would expose them to endless lawsuits and second-guessing. Reform advocates countered that accountability was not the same as impossibility, that officers in other countries and other jurisdictions operated under stronger oversight without collapsing, that protecting officers from consequences for misconduct ultimately undermined rather than supported effective policing. Eleanor brought a particular credibility to these debates because of her background, because she had been both a judge who sent people to prison and a victim of police misconduct, because she understood the legal system intimately and could speak authoritatively about where reforms were needed and what they would accomplish. Her voice carried weight with elected officials and with media and with community members who might have been skeptical of reform advocacy from people without her institutional experience. She worked particularly closely with a younger organizer named Jamal Stevens, a black man in his 30s who had experienced police violence firsthand and who had built a grassroots organization focused on police accountability. Jamal had been stopped and frisked dozens of times, had been arrested for charges that were later dismissed, had seen family members and friends incarcerated for minor offenses while watching police officers escape consequences for serious misconduct. Their collaboration was generative, brought together Eleanor's institutional knowledge and Jamal's grassroots organizing capacity, bridged generational and class differences that sometimes created tension in reform movements. They worked on developing a community oversight proposal that would give civilians meaningful authority over police discipline, that would allow independent investigators to examine complaints rather than relying on internal affairs, that would create transparency around officer misconduct records and discipline outcomes. The proposal faced significant opposition from the police union and from some city council members who were closely aligned with law enforcement interests. But it also gained support from civil rights organizations, from faith communities, from neighborhood associations in areas where aggressive policing was common, and from a growing number of elected officials who recognized that public trust in police was eroding and that meaningful reform was necessary to rebuild that trust. If these dynamics, these organizing efforts, and these challenges of navigating institutional resistance to accountability resonate with your understanding of how change happens or fails to happen in your own community, consider the value of ensuring that accounts like Eleanor's reach audiences beyond those already engaged in reform work. Systemic change requires sustained attention and collective action, and stories that make abstract policy debates concrete and personal serve essential purposes in building that attention and action. The City Council held public hearings on the oversight proposal, and Eleanor testified, describing her experience with Officer Matthews and connecting it to broader patterns of misconduct and inadequate accountability. She spoke for 8 minutes, presenting data on complaint rates and discipline outcomes, comparing Atlanta's police accountability mechanisms to those in other major cities, and making the case that civilian oversight was not anti-police, but pro-accountability, that it served both communities and the vast majority of officers who performed their duties professionally. The hearing room was packed, with supporters and opponents of the proposal both turning out in large numbers. The testimony stretched over 3 days, with dozens of speakers sharing perspectives, ranging from passionate support to fierce opposition. Police union representatives argued that the oversight proposal would create a hostile environment for officers, would subject them to politically motivated investigations, would undermine their authority and their safety. Community members countered with stories of their own experiences with police misconduct, with frustration about complaints that went nowhere, with demands for accountability that had been ignored for years. The City Council ultimately passed a modified version of the oversight proposal, creating a civilian review board with authority to examine complaints and to make recommendations to the Chief of Police, but stopping short of giving the board direct disciplinary authority. It was a compromise, weaker than what Eleanor and other advocates had pushed for, but stronger than the status quo. The board would at least provide some independent review, would create some transparency, would give communities some voice in how police misconduct was addressed. Eleanor was appointed to serve on the Civilian Review Board, her judicial experience and her personal experience with police misconduct making her an obvious choice. She accepted the appointment, understanding that the work would be difficult, that the board's limited authority would be frustrating, but that even limited oversight was better than none, and that the board could potentially be strengthened over time through demonstrated effectiveness and continued advocacy. The board began its work 6 months after Eleanor's encounter with Officer Matthews, reviewing complaints that had been filed against Atlanta police officers, conducting investigations where internal affairs findings appeared inadequate, making recommendations for discipline or policy changes. Eleanor brought to the work her judicial rigor, her commitment to thorough fact-finding, her understanding of how to evaluate evidence and assess credibility. The cases that came before the board revealed patterns that Eleanor had suspected, but that were now documented in granular detail. Complaints disproportionately came from black civilians, particularly black men, but also black women and children. Complaints were often dismissed by internal affairs without serious investigation, particularly when they involved alleged discourtesy or minor force rather than serious injury. Officers with multiple complaints rarely faced escalating discipline, were treated as though each incident existed in isolation rather than as part of a pattern. One case that particularly troubled Eleanor involved a young black woman named Keisha Williams, who had been stopped while driving in Buckhead, an affluent, predominantly white neighborhood where Keisha worked as a home health aide. The officer who stopped her, a white man named Todd Brennan, claimed he had pulled her over for a broken taillight, but Keisha's car had no broken taillight, and the stop appeared to be pretext for questioning why she was in the neighborhood. The interaction had escalated, with Officer Brennan becoming aggressive and eventually handcuffing Keisha and searching her car without consent or probable cause, finding nothing illegal but traumatizing Keisha in the process. Keisha had filed a complaint, and Internal Affairs had found no violation of policy, concluding that Officer Brennan had reasonable suspicion for the stop and that the search was incident to a lawful arrest for obstruction when Keisha questioned his authority to search her vehicle. But the Civilian Review Board, examining the same evidence, saw a different story, saw a pretextual stop based on racial profiling, saw an escalation driven by the officer's assumptions about a black woman's presence in a white neighborhood, saw a search that violated Fourth Amendment protections. The board recommended that the stop be found unjustified, that Officer Brennan receive discipline for unlawful search, and that he undergo additional training on constitutional policing. The Chief of Police accepted some of the recommendations, requiring the training, but declining to discipline Officer Brennan for the search, citing the original Internal Affairs finding and the legal complexities around qualified immunity that would make civil liability unlikely. It was a partial victory, better than the original Internal Affairs dismissal, but less than full accountability, and it illustrated both the value and the limitations of civilian oversight. The board could surface problems and push for reform, but it could not compel action, could not override police leadership when they chose to protect officers, could not change the fundamental power dynamics that made police accountability so difficult. Eleanor continued serving on the board for 3 years, reviewing dozens of cases, making hundreds of recommendations, advocating constantly for stronger authority and for reforms that would address systemic problems rather than just individual incidents. The work was exhausting and often demoralizing, required confronting repeatedly the gap between accountability rhetoric and accountability reality, required accepting modest progress when justice demanded transformation. But the work also mattered, created some transparency where previously there had been none, gave communities some voice where previously they had been silenced, prevented some misconduct from being simply swept away through internal processes designed to protect officers. Eleanor heard from people regularly who thanked her for serving on the board, who felt that finally someone with authority was taking their complaints seriously, who saw in the board's work at least the possibility of accountability, even if the reality remained limited. She also faced criticism and hostility, particularly from police unions and from officers who saw civilian oversight as an attack on their profession. She received threatening messages, was called anti-police and radical and worse, was accused of second-guessing split-second decisions from the safety of hindsight. The criticism was sometimes personally directed and sometimes professional, questioning her judgment and her motives and her right to evaluate police conduct. Eleanor had thick skin developed over decades of being a black woman in positions of authority, had learned to distinguish between substantive criticism that deserved response and bad faith attacks designed to intimidate or silence. She responded to the former and ignored the latter, continued doing the work regardless of the hostility it generated, understood that resistance was evidence that the work was actually threatening entrenched interests rather than being merely symbolic. Her grandchildren, Lisa's teenagers, asked her once why she was spending so much time on the Civilian Review Board, why she did not just enjoy her retirement, why she kept taking on work that was stressful and controversial and that some people criticized her for. Eleanor thought carefully before answering, wanting to give them an honest response that acknowledged the costs while explaining why she believed the work was necessary. "When that police officer pushed me at the crosswalk," Eleanor told them, "I could have let it go. I could have accepted his apology and moved on with my life. I have enough privilege and status that I could have chosen not to make an issue of it. But I kept thinking about all the other people who get treated that way by police, who don't have my resources or my knowledge of the system or my connections. If I stay silent when I have power to speak, I'm protecting a system that harms people who can't protect themselves. That's not who I want to be." Her grandson Marcus, 17 years old, and increasingly aware of how police treated young black men, nodded understanding. "I get stopped by police sometimes. They always assume I'm up to something, always ask what I'm doing in whatever neighborhood I'm in, always make me feel like I'm not supposed to be there. It's exhausting." "That's exactly why this work matters," Eleanor said, "because you should be able to walk around your own city without being treated as suspicious. Because police should be protecting everyone, not just treating certain communities as problems to be managed. Because accountability has to mean something, or the mistreatment just continues." Marcus's sister, Angela, 15 and politically engaged, asked whether the Civilian Review Board was actually making a difference, or whether it was just giving the appearance of accountability without creating real change. It was a sophisticated question, reflected her understanding that institutions often created oversight mechanisms that looked meaningful, but that lacked real authority. "That's the right question to ask," Eleanor told her, "and the honest answer is complicated. The board has limited power, can't force the department to discipline officers or change policies, but it creates transparency that didn't exist before, gives communities some voice, makes it harder for misconduct to just disappear into internal processes. Is that enough? No, but it's more than nothing, and sometimes building toward adequate accountability requires accepting incremental progress while continuing to push for more." The conversation continued, and Eleanor appreciated her grandchildren's engagement, their willingness to think critically about institutions and power and change. They were growing up in a different Atlanta than the one Eleanor had navigated as a young lawyer, had access to information and organizing tools and political consciousness that her generation had lacked. But they were also inheriting many of the same challenges, still faced police who treated them with suspicion, still lived in a society where racial inequality was systemic and where accountability for those who harmed black communities was minimal. Eleanor thought about what kind of world she wanted to leave them, what kind of institutions and practices and cultural norms she wanted them to inherit. And she thought about how her own experience at the Crosswalk, her encounter with Officer Matthews, had catalyzed work that might contribute to creating slightly better conditions, slightly more accountability, slightly greater justice than had existed before. It was not enough. It would never be enough. The system required transformation far more substantial than what civilian review boards or individual discipline cases could accomplish. But Eleanor had learned over decades of legal and judicial work that transformation happened through accumulation of incremental changes. That systemic reform required both immediate responses to individual injustices and sustained efforts to change structures and cultures and power relationships. She continued the work, serving on the Civilian Review Board and advocating for police reform, and speaking publicly about accountability and supporting community organizations, and using her platform and her expertise toward justice. And she thought often about how arbitrary it was that she had the platform, that she had survived to age 73 with resources and knowledge and connections, that she had been able to demand accountability when Officer Matthews pushed her in that crosswalk. How many other people had similar encounters without similar resources? How many were pushed or grabbed or threatened or harmed by police officers who faced no consequences because their victims lacked Eleanor's institutional authority? How many incidents of misconduct went unrecorded, unreported, unaddressed because the people targeted knew or believed that complaining would accomplish nothing? These questions had no satisfying answers, only the recognition that Eleanor's story was exceptional in its outcome but representative in its underlying dynamics, that what had happened to her happened constantly to others with different results. That visibility of injustice did not automatically produce justice, but that invisibility guaranteed injustice would continue unchallenged. 5 years after the encounter at the Crosswalk, Eleanor was 78 years old, still serving on the Civilian Review Board, still advocating for police reform, still working with community organizations and testifying at hearings and writing op-eds and using her experience and expertise toward accountability. The work had become central to her retirement, had given purpose and direction to years that might otherwise have been defined primarily by leisure and family time. She had mixed feelings about this, sometimes wondered whether she should have simply enjoyed retirement rather than taking on demanding and stressful work, whether the toll on her energy and her peace of mind was worth the modest progress that had been achieved. But mostly she felt that the work was necessary, that people with her resources and platform had obligations to use them toward justice, that retirement was not absolution from social responsibility. The Civilian Review Board had reviewed more than 400 complaints during Eleanor's tenure, had made recommendations that led to discipline in about a third of cases, had surfaced patterns that contributed to policy changes around use of force and stop-and-frisk practices and body camera requirements. The board's authority remained limited. Its recommendations could still be overridden by police leadership, but it had established itself as a legitimate voice on police accountability and had built credibility with both communities and with some reform-minded officers. Eleanor had also seen Officer Matthews occasionally over the years, had passed him once in a courthouse hallway and another time at a community meeting about public safety. He had not approached her or acknowledged her, had kept distance as if their encounter had never happened, or as if proximity might reignite a conflict he preferred to forget. Eleanor did not know what Officer Matthews had learned from the experience, whether the discipline and retraining had changed his approach to policing, or whether he had simply become more careful about whom he treated disrespectfully. She knew from the board's work that he had received one additional complaint in the years since their encounter, an allegation of excessive force during an arrest that had been investigated and dismissed by Internal Affairs. The review board had examined that case and had disagreed with Internal Affairs findings, had recommended additional training and supervision, but again the Chief of Police had declined to implement the full recommendations. The pattern suggested that Officer Matthews had not fundamentally changed, that he continued approaching the job in ways that generated complaints, that the accountability mechanisms had been insufficient to either reform his conduct or remove him from patrol duties. It was frustrating but not surprising, was consistent with what Eleanor had learned about how difficult it was to actually change individual officer behavior or departmental culture through discipline and training alone. The problems were deeper than individual officers, were rooted in how police were trained and supervised and evaluated, in what behaviors were rewarded and what were tolerated, in how departments related to the communities they served. Real reform required changes far more substantial than Eleanor's encounter with Officer Matthews had catalyzed, required reimagining public safety and police roles and accountability mechanisms and resource allocation. It required political will and sustained organizing and willingness to challenge powerful interests and to accept conflict with police unions and with constituencies that viewed any police criticism as betrayal of law and order. Eleanor had done what she could within her capacity and her context, had used her experience at that crosswalk as catalyst for advocacy and organizing and institutional change. But she was also aware that her individual efforts, however sustained and serious, were modest relative to the scale of need, that the machinery of police violence and unaccountability was vast and deeply embedded and resistant to transformation. These realities could be paralyzing if you let them, could lead to resignation or cynicism or retreat into private comfort. Eleanor had been tempted by that retreat, had imagined sometimes what it would be like to simply stop engaging with these issues, to travel and read and spend time with family and enjoy the privilege that her career had created. But she could not quite let go, could not forget what it had felt like to be pushed by Officer Matthews, could not ignore the ongoing reality of police misconduct that she encountered through the review board's work. So she continued, slower now as age reduced her energy, more selective about which battles to engage, but still present and still vocal and still committed to the work of accountability and justice. And she thought about what would happen when she could no longer serve on the review board. Who would take her place, whether the momentum that had been built would be sustained or would dissipate as attention moved to other issues and as the urgency of that moment at the crosswalk receded into history. The question was not just about Eleanor's individual role, but about how movements sustained themselves, how reform efforts persisted beyond the individuals who initiated them, how accountability mechanisms remained robust rather than becoming captured or ineffective over time. The Civilian Review Board was an institution now, had procedures and staff and legitimacy, but institutions could atrophy or be undermined or lose their animating purpose if not tended carefully and defended against those who wanted them to fail. Eleanor worked on succession, on mentoring younger advocates who could take leadership roles, on building organizational capacity that would outlast any individual member. She knew she would not see the full transformation she worked toward, that the arc of progress was longer than individual lifetimes, that the best she could do was contribute her piece and ensure that others could build on what she had helped create. At 79, Eleanor had a health scare, a small stroke that required hospitalization and rehabilitation, and that left her with some mobility challenges that made using her cane even more essential. The stroke was a reminder of mortality, of the reality that she would not have unlimited time to continue this work, that choices about how to spend remaining years needed to be made thoughtfully. She stepped down from the Civilian Review Board, her departure marked by testimonials from community organizations and from some city officials and from board colleagues who credited her with establishing the board's credibility and its commitment to thorough investigation and fair process. She was replaced by a younger black woman, a civil rights attorney named Tamika Johnson, who brought similar judicial rigor and community trust and commitment to accountability. Eleanor continued advocating in less formal ways, writing occasional op-eds, speaking when invited, advising organizations working on police reform, staying connected to the work even as she stepped back from formal institutional roles. And she reflected on what had been accomplished and what remained undone, on the distance traveled since that afternoon at the Crosswalk, and the distance still to travel toward justice. The encounter with Officer Matthews had been a catalyst, but not a conclusion, had opened opportunities for accountability work but had not resolved the underlying problems that made such encounters common. Police misconduct continued. Accountability remained inadequate. Communities continued experiencing aggressive and disrespectful policing. Officers continued being protected by union contracts and qualified immunity and internal processes designed to shield them from consequences. But some things had changed incrementally and imperfectly, but measurably. The Civilian Review Board existed when it had not existed before. Transparency around police discipline had increased. Community voice in police accountability had some institutional channels rather than being purely external protest. These changes were modest, were insufficient, but they were real, and they mattered to specific individuals who received more thorough investigations or who had their complaints taken seriously, or who saw some accountability where previously there had been none. Eleanor thought about whether these changes were worth the energy and stress and time she had invested over 5 years, whether the incremental progress justified the exhaustion and the hostility and the sacrifice of peaceful retirement. The calculus was impossible to conduct precisely, involved weighing concrete personal costs against diffuse social benefits, involved valuing current modest improvements against hoped-for future transformation. But when Eleanor thought about that moment at the Crosswalk, about Officer Matthews's hand on her shoulder pushing her, about her decision to pull out her retired judge identification rather than just continuing across the street, she knew that she would make the same choice again. Not because the choice had produced optimal outcomes, or because the accountability had been complete, or because the system had been transformed, but because staying silent when you had voice and accepting mistreatment when you had power to challenge it was a form of complicity that Eleanor could not accept. She had used what she had leveraged her platform and her expertise and her credibility toward accountability and reform, had refused to treat her own experience as exceptional rather than representative, had insisted that if an officer would push a retired judge in a crosswalk, that officer would certainly mistreat civilians who lacked her institutional authority. And she had built or contributed to building structures that made accountability slightly more possible, that gave communities slightly more voice, that created transparency where previously there had been opacity. It was not enough. It would never be enough as long as the fundamental structures of policing remained unchanged, as long as officers could use force with minimal accountability, as long as complaints were investigated by the very departments whose officers were being complained about, as long as unions protected problematic officers and qualified immunity shielded them from civil liability. But it was something. It was more than would have existed if Eleanor had simply accepted her treatment at the Crosswalk without demanding accountability, if she had used her privilege to resolve the matter quietly rather than publicly, if she had chosen comfort over advocacy. And in the gap between nothing and enough, in the space of incremental progress and sustained organizing and persistent pressure for change, Eleanor had contributed what she could with the resources and time available to her. She thought about her grandchildren, now young adults navigating a world that was different from but also disturbingly similar to the one she had navigated as a young lawyer. They still faced police who treated them with suspicion, still lived in a society where racial inequality shaped every institution, still had to learn how to navigate interactions with law enforcement in ways that minimized risk while maintaining dignity. But they also had slightly better tools and slightly stronger accountability mechanisms and slightly more public awareness about police misconduct than previous generations had possessed. They could record police interactions on their phones. They could file complaints with civilian review boards that had at least some independence from police departments. They could organize and advocate within a political culture that had at least some openness to reform after years of high-profile police violence and sustained protest. These advantages were modest, did not eliminate risk or prevent mistreatment, but they shifted the terrain slightly, made resistance slightly more possible and accountability slightly less improbable. And they existed partly because of work that Eleanor and others had done, partly because people who experienced police misconduct chose to speak about it publicly rather than accepting it privately, partly because advocates persisted in demanding change, even when change came slowly and incompletely. If you have followed Eleanor Hayes's journey from that crosswalk encounter to years of accountability work, if you recognize in her choices and her commitments something that resonates with your own values or experiences or aspirations, consider how you might contribute to the ongoing work of police reform and accountability in your own context. The patterns Eleanor confronted are not unique to Atlanta, are not isolated incidents but symptoms of systemic problems that exist across jurisdictions and that require collective action to address. The work continues, as it always does, beyond individual stories and individual lifetimes, requiring sustained commitment and strategic organizing and willingness to accept incremental progress while maintaining vision of transformation. Eleanor's encounter with Officer Matthews was one moment in one city, but it connected to patterns that were national and systemic and that demanded responses that were equally broad and sustained. She had done her part, had used what happened at that crosswalk as catalyst for years of advocacy, had leveraged her platform and expertise toward accountability and reform. Others would need to continue the work, would need to build on foundations that had been laid, would need to push further than Eleanor's generation had been able to push toward the justice that remained aspirational rather than actual. At 81, Eleanor Hayes was still living independently in her house in Cascade, still reading and thinking and staying connected to reform work even as her direct involvement diminished. She had survived more than 8 decades as a black woman in America, had built a distinguished legal career, had experienced both institutional authority and police misconduct, had used her experience and her resources toward justice with the understanding that the work was never finished. The intersection of Peachtree and 14th remained unchanged physically. The same crosswalk where Officer Matthews had pushed her still functioning as it had before, cars and pedestrians navigating the same space where that encounter had occurred. But the encounter itself had rippled outward in ways both visible and invisible, had contributed to accountability processes and reform efforts and public conversations about police conduct and civilian oversight. Whether those ripples would accumulate into waves substantial enough to transform the underlying conditions that made police misconduct common and accountability rare, that remained uncertain, depended on factors far beyond any individual's control or contribution. But Eleanor had learned over 8 decades that uncertainty was not justification for inaction, that not knowing whether efforts would succeed was not reason to abandon the efforts, that the obligation was to act toward justice regardless of guaranteed outcomes. She had acted, had used what she had toward what she believed was right, had refused to accept police misconduct quietly, even when accepting it would have been easier and more comfortable. And in doing so, she had contributed to making accountability slightly more possible, community voice slightly stronger, police reform slightly more conceivable for the communities and the generations that would inherit the world she was leaving. That was the story, complex and ongoing and irreducible to simple inspiration or simple condemnation. That was the reality of how change happened or failed to happen, of how individuals with privilege made choices about whether to use that privilege for justice or for comfort. That was the challenge extended to anyone encountering this account, to recognize it, not as exceptional but as exemplary, to understand that what Eleanor did with her experience was what everyone with resources and platform should do with theirs, to act accordingly with whatever capacity they possess toward the accountability and transformation that justice requires.